Are we live? I think we are. Okay, great. I just got a message saying we are live. There we are. And I can see us now on YouTube. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for joining us today. I can see from YouTube that we've got about 130 odd people so far with us. So that's a great showing. Thanks for joining us for this event. We're hosting this as part of JCWI's Work It Out campaign, which issues an urgent and timely call for the government to level up the rights of migrant workers. When the end of the pandemic is finally declared, we'll owe our survival not to walls or to hostility, but to millions and millions of workers who've risked their lives, sometimes with no say and no choice in the matter, to feed us, to care for us, to carry us through this crisis. Many have come from other places. Many have suffered untold exploitation and been exposed to unnecessary risk. All of them deserve the right to live and work safely with dignity and good health. For more information about the campaign and what you can do to fight for the rights of migrant workers, please visit jcwi.org.uk/workitout. And I'm really delighted to be joined this evening by Emily Kenway. Emily, welcome, and thanks for joining us. Emily's a writer and an activist. She currently works as part of the Rights Lab's Business and Economies programme at the University of Nottingham. And prior to that, she was an advisor at the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner. She was campaign manager at the Living Wage Foundation, and recently she was senior policy and communications advisor at Focus on Labour Exploitation, or FLEX. Emily's new book, which I've got here, The Truth About Modern Slavery, hits bookshelves next week and is available for you to pre-order now. This book, which I read over Christmas, is a must-read for anyone who believes that there is something wrong in the way that labour markets operate, in the way that we treat workers, and in the need to fight to protect rights and to fight for justice. It's forensic in its detail and damning in its indictment, but it's also just really human and a really compelling and incredibly accessible read. So please do order a copy. It wouldn't really be an event on labour exploitation if I didn't implore you all to either order directly from the publisher or to support local smaller bookshops wherever you can. And if you order before the 20th of January, we're really grateful that Pluto Press have generously offered to donate £1 from every pre-ordered copy to JCWI to support our work fighting the hostile environment and protecting the rights of people subject to immigration law. I'm not going to talk very much. I'm going to start with some questions in a moment. Just to run everyone through the order for the event, we'll do about 30 to 40 minutes of conversation with Emily. So I'll be asking a few pre-prepared questions, which Emily hasn't seen. And then you're very welcome, anyone watching this event on YouTube, to put comments in the box, which I'm told should be over this side on your screens. And then I'll relay those to Emily about 30 to 40 minutes in. So put your questions in the chat box, and anything that gets discussed that has a link or a web link or further reading that gets highlighted, we'll send everyone an email with all of those links afterwards. So without further ado, Emily, I've been following your work at Flex, your work with the Anti-Slavery Commission, and of course your writing for a long time. Could you start by telling us a little bit about you and what brought you to this field, what that journey was, and how, or what prompted you really to write this amazing book?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me today. Well, obviously, that's probably a long and winding story, but I think there's kind of key moments that have culminated in this book, really. Back in 2013 was the first time I encountered this phrase, modern slavery, as a way of talking about exploitation. I was working at an NGO then called Share Action, and we were doing some work on the modern slavery bill. And alongside that, I set up a campaign outside work against Amazon, the company. It's funny you recommend people not shop there. And part of that campaign was gathering testimony from warehouse workers in Amazon's fulfillment centers, as they call them. And it was really, obviously I was aware of exploitation, aware of this growing modern slavery narrative because of my job, but it was really this project that brought home to me the kind of systematic disdain for people's dignity that we have happening in the UK, and obviously in lots of other contexts as well, perpetrated by corporations. Some of the stories were really horrendous. People fired for taking a day off for caring for a partner who'd lost a baby. This kind of really heartbreaking stuff. And that kind of ignited in me a determination to try to be part of solutions in whatever way I could. And I definitely, continue to think what is the best way of going about that, as I'm sure we all do. I then spent 3 years as a trustee of a wonderful charity called the Voice of Domestic Workers, which is for migrant domestic workers and led by them and for them. And again, this was another moment of realizing what's going on in our communities and the causes of it that aren't being addressed. And overall, really, through working on modern slavery issues, it created in me a huge amount of anger, really, as I'm sure you've read the book. Someone messaged me the other day who's read it as well and said it's beautifully scathing, which I think is accurate. It created just like a real fury that people's real exploitation is being co-opted into this narrative that looks like it's saving them, that looks like it's supporting them, but is actually perpetrating it and entrenching it. And I really wanted to bring that to bear, to look at the whole picture. It doesn't just look at brands, it looks at immigration, sex sector, awareness raising, the whole picture of what's going on. And crucially, there's loads of really cool, amazing scholarship, very much in line with what I'm saying. And I felt like there was a really great opportunity for an accessible book that brought that to people who aren't familiar with this topic, maybe have just seen news items about modern slavery, or are more familiar, but there's still kind of research and in-depth stuff to get into. So it was that kind of, that's the journey, really.
Well, it certainly is. It certainly is an accessible book, and it also shatters. I think it really shatters effectively a lot of what even the best intentioned people, I think, might think or might already sort of think we know about modern slavery. Just going back to sort of people who may have only seen snippets on the news or read a little bit here or there. This question, I guess, is sort of in a couple of parts, and going right back to basics. What is modern slavery, and is it slavery, and is it modern? What makes it different from other types of slavery that people might have heard about or learned about?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and obviously one that is going to have a relatively long but hopefully interesting answer. So there's two parts to this answer, really. Okay, so there's the simple answer of what does modern slavery mean? Kind of like if you were a policeman, what would you think it meant? What are you looking for? So it's an umbrella term for different types of severe exploitation. So the types under that umbrella are things like forced labor, human trafficking, domestic servitude, which each have their own slightly distinct definition that we don't necessarily need to go into. But essentially, the International Organization of Migration says modern slavery is a situation of exploitation from which someone is prevented from leaving, or they can't refuse to be in. And that could be because of like threats or violence, but it also can be because of something called abuse of vulnerability. So your vulnerability could be that you're drug dependent, it could be that you've got some kind of disability, but it could also be that you're at risk of impoverishment or becoming undocumented, right? So it's a very, very, very broad church. And as I think it's fairly clear that I think in the book, like trying to quantify something that is this different, that pertains to every single gender, age group, nationality, like, we're talking about all exploitation that's pretty bad, basically. And that's, is that really a singular thing? So, but setting that aside, there's been lots of work by academics and lawyers and, you know, NGO experts on like, let's try to define modern slavery. And I point to some of it in the early part of the book. But what I really wanted to do was not spend time being like, well, this is and this isn't, but because I don't think that's doable anyway. But instead, to start to bring to people this idea that modern slavery is what's called a frame. So this is from the American cognitive linguist George Lakoff. So a frame is like, he says, a mental structure that shapes how we see the world. It's like a story or a picture. I think it's very useful to think about it as a literal frame. So this is a frame. It's about exploitation. It's the modern slavery frame of exploitation. And there are particular characters in that frame. There are particular causes that we can see in that picture, particular kinds of solutions. So particular people are the hero in that picture, you know, this kind of thing. And crucially, there are things that are outside that frame that we're not seeing in this picture. And when we start to understand modern slavery as a particular kind of story about exploitation, this is where it gets really interesting, and where what I hope the book does, it suddenly sort of pulls a thread and everything kind of unravels and we see it in a totally different way. So clearly, when we're talking about exploitation as modern slavery, we are invoking the idea of historical slavery. That's what it's doing in our mind. And I think campaigners did this for like laudable reasons, some campaigners, in terms of drawing political and media attention to the idea, because it's sensationalizing, isn't it? It's like, how many headlines have you seen about exploitation versus modern slavery, right? But it's being co-opted. So when we think about modern slavery, we think of historical slavery. So yes, there's certain images that might come to mind: manacles, ships, you know, racial oppression. And there are particular characteristics of that shape the modern slavery story. So one of the things that it does is, if you look at the way historical slavery is told today, it's told as the UK being the heroes, right? So you can't move for mentions of Wilberforce in modern slavery speeches and materials. And indeed, it's the 2019 Conservative Manifesto says in it, as we abolished historical slavery, so we will abolish modern slavery. You know, we're kind of forgetting a little bit before the abolishment there. And actually, the abolition of legal ownership of one person by another in the 19th century led to a lot of the things that we're now calling modern slavery, right? So systematic exploitation of people on plantations that just weren't legally owned, but de facto were. But, you know, as importantly, when we think about historical slavery, no one thinks historical slavery should still exist, right? No matter which bit of the political spectrum they're on. Nobody, and it's treated like this anomaly in history, like this, you know, we vanquished it, we came in as heroes, we abolished historical slavery, right? So it's seen as this kind of aberration of history against which we are all on the same side. In modern slavery, that carries through. That is a really core part of what's in that frame, where this turns into talking about exploitation as an anomaly, an aberration, right? So you'll see in the language, I mean, it was really fun in some ways to research this book, because you'll see in the language used by new abolitionists, it's talked about as a parasite, as a virus, as a stain. We need to inoculate against it. We need to scrub our supply chains. And these things are all about seeing it as something like a fleck on something that's otherwise fine. A rotten apple, not the barrel, this kind of thing. And so we see it in this way that it's exceptional, it's separable from the whole of what's going on. It's got nothing to do with wider issues. It's perpetrated by criminals, by individual deviants. It's not about like state stuff. And I'll just give you like an example in practice. Homeless shelters have been recruiting grounds by offenders looking to exploit people. And that's because obviously people there are vulnerable in the sense that they have few or no options, and therefore are kind of exploitable, because they're going to say yes to a dodgy offer that you and I wouldn't say yes to because we have options. There's a man called Mark who was recruited from a homeless shelter and horrifically exploited for years, and he gave an interview to the BBC where he said once he'd realised the situation he was in with this exploiter, he had to make a decision about whether to try to leave or to stay. And he chose, it was a choice between two evils, and he chose the lesser evil, which was to stay, because his choice was between a bit of shelter, no shelter, a bit of food, no food. So in this way, we can see that, yes, there's an offender, but the offender has been given like a wide open door. In the UK, we've had 167% rise in rough sleeping between 2010 and 2018. You know, like, I could go on. So it's this erasure of this, how exploitation is systemically produced, and making it into this like moral crusade that is just like, oops, this virulent strain come back.
That really comes out in the book. One thing that I think the book does incredibly well, as you say, is sort of break that frame. So, you know, you can't really, you know, if you're the chief executive of a company, kind of doing PowerPoints at Davos or whatever it is you do when you're saying that you're fighting modern slavery, it's quite difficult to say that you know, this is a virus, or this is an aberration, or it's an anomaly, and we're sort of surprised that this has happened. And it's always, the language is passive. This is something that has happened to our supply chains, as opposed to me and my shareholders have said to our buyers, go out and get the cheapest produce, push the costs down, push the profit margins up at whatever cost. And we've systematically lobbied governments to lower the regulations on labour protection. So we shouldn't really be surprised that it is happening, because we've done it. Basically, this is the sort of the bitter harvest of what we've sowed, in a way. But on governments, I mean, we've got people again looking at this for the first time, or people who've looked at it a little bit, will probably get the impression that governments and businesses everywhere are really pulling out all the stops. It's really hard to go on. You know, I bought a pair of running shoes a few weeks ago, and it's basically impossible to go on a website without one of the, you know, the top 5 things on a website being modern slavery. Here's our statement about what we're doing. And you know, Theresa May talked about it a lot. This government certainly does. Current Home Secretary, who incidentally, one of her first jobs was doing PR lobbying for a tobacco company after they were implicated in the scandal of employing slaves, and paying off the army in Burma in order to get away with it. So there's some irony in career choices there. But people might think that they're really pulling out all the stops. What is it that they're not doing? What is it? What is this gap? Where is this gap between rhetoric and reality?
Yeah. Essentially, the gap is identified by seeing that if you weight your anti-slavery, anti-exploitation activity towards this idea that it's a rare, exceptional thing, then your focus is very much on criminal justice, on a law enforcement approach to it. And it's what they kind of do is like make it a totally separate category, like that has nothing to do with anything else that's going on. What we actually know is that labour conditions exist on a continuum, from decent working conditions through abuse like wage theft up to the most severe forms of exploitation. But it's a very grey area between those ends. People move along between different points on it. It's not like you can just kind of separate off this particular bit. Only by trying to make it separable and trying to make it a discrete problem that can be treated, like I say, like a fleck of something, and when everything else is fine. Only by doing that do we end up with solutions that aren't really solutions. So, for example, posters in homeless shelters so people can spot the signs of a slave rather than addressing destitution, or the modern slavery statements by companies, which maybe we'll talk about more, but don't require companies to actually do anything. And not only that, don't regulate the things we know drive exploitation. So you were talking about purchasing practices. Why are they not regulated? Because we're told it's this totally separate thing. And I know one of the ways it's like most noticeable is in the corporate space. I'll give you a case that happened to illustrate this. In 2016, a man called Mohammed Rafiq was jailed at Leeds Crown Court for employing essentially like a slave. It was billed as a slave workforce of 42 Hungarian men to build beds into bed workshops.
Oh, this is the John Lewis and others.
Yeah, I'm sure they really. Yes. I'm sure John Lewis loved that you just said that. The John Lewis. Yeah. So it was reported that these bed factories were selling into well-known high street brands. And this was like a classic case. These men had been recruited in Hungary by a middleman. They'd been deceived about the terms. They turned up. It was paid like £10 a week. It was really atrocious situation. Now, these factories had ethical audits done by buyers not that long before this came to light, and those audits found nothing untoward. And this is a really perfect example of how problematically the modern slavery story operates, right? So an audit, it is like I say in the book, it's like the least sexy sounding thing in the world, but it is a really useful way of understanding what's going on. It's obviously just someone coming in and like checking certain things, right? And it can be done better or worse within those parameters. But fundamental to the auditing, and by the way, it's like the main tool in the toolbox of corporate anti-slavery stuff. You will not find a modern slavery statement that doesn't mention auditing. Fundamental to an audit is this idea that modern slavery is something identifiable and extricable, right? You can go in with a clipboard and you can identify and extricate the problem. A couple of academics have looked at how companies talk about modern slavery, and they found essentially like what I'm saying, which is that they cast themselves as the protagonists, the active party, so sending in the auditors, and the workforce as a substance to be acted upon, passive, which is what happens with audits. In general, audits, they don't work very well at all for lots of different reasons, but one of the core reasons is this power thing, right? You're telling me you want to know about the working conditions and whether anyone is being severely exploited in your factory, on your farm, whatever, and yet you are making the power nowhere near the workers' hands. Whereas there is a time-honoured, tried and tested way of having continuous monitoring of workers' rights and ascertaining how they feel about their terms and conditions, and they're called trade unions. But you will barely hear trade unions mentioned when you're working on this topic, and if you raise it in meetings with companies, you'll be told it's got nothing to do with modern slavery, because modern slavery is a crime. And that's a law enforcement issue. We've got special audits.
It's not a labour market or a labour rights or workers' rights issue. It's the cognitive dissonance is remarkable.
Yeah, right. And it's massively, it's purely born of this idea that this is some kind of separate thing. Whereas, even the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking has said, like, when you have more labour abuses allowed to flourish, you create a breeding ground for the most extreme.
And am I right in assuming that in that audit process there isn't really much power to compel information? There's no burden on the employer to verify and evidence what they're saying. It's not incredibly high. There's no huge evidence threshold.
Auditors don't have any legal power. In fact, one of my friends used to work for a company that audits. Like, this is how mad stuff is. When you work on this topic, you just start being like, everything is an emperor's new clothes, and people are making a lot of money from those new clothes.
Yeah, the entire farce of asking auditors basically go up to an employer and say, have you got any slaves? And
I mean, they can be done. Yeah, they can be done better than that, obviously. Like, that's like the worst possible version, and and there are some like within the scope of auditing, there would be some best practice examples where, for example, they might interview workers off-site and choose random workers, not ones management is putting forward, but it's still within this framework of it's not disturbing the power imbalance, and that's really the thing that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. So the auditors, the auditors just don't have the power. They might have the intention, they might have the dedication, but there's no power there, and the workers certainly don't have any power.
The workers aren't. Yeah, if you actually you are saying you care about workers' conditions, why are trade unions not part of this solution picture? Because they don't fit in the modern slavery frame, and that is tactical.
It's an evergreen point and an evergreen question. Why are we not talking about trade unions and labour rights? Now, a lot of people watching this event, because we're JCWI, and a lot of people may have come through our website or from our Twitter or our email list. A lot of people will be really interested in hearing about how migration policy and borders intersect with the perils of labour exploitation and modern slavery. But a lot of people who might be watching or might watch this back later might not know that much or really appreciate the links between borders and labour exploitation, because we've got sort of two narratives in a way, or two frames here in the UK. We've got, governments allegedly pulling out all the stops to get rid of what they call this peril, this sickness, this crime. It's a criminal justice issue. It's a law enforcement issue, as they sort of view modern slavery. And then you've got another frame, which is borders need to be hostile places. We need to tighten our borders, and that's also a law enforcement issue. So sometimes the things get kind of presented as serving the same goal in a way, but for someone who might not be familiar with the intersection, how are these two things connected? How do borders play a role in perpetuating labour exploitation?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and there are, I guess, there are a couple of main ways that these two topics intersect. The first thing is you said there's like these two narratives, like tackling modern slavery and hardening borders. And unfortunately, what the modern slavery story does is use people's real exploitation to legitimize harder borders, which is kind of, there's a lot of things in the book where you see these hypocrisies, and they're actually really heartbreaking because there's a human collateral to those. But it's definitely one of the biggest hypocrisies in there. So, you see with the horrendous death of 39 people in October 2019 in Essex, you immediately saw the local MP and the Priti Patel alluding to it being a case of people trafficking before they even knew the nationality of the people who'd lost their lives. So they did not know it was a case of trafficking. For something to be trafficking, you need to have exploitation or intention to exploit. And they were reporting that the people were Chinese, so they obviously didn't know anything. And as I explained in the book, I think that the reason that was done by politicians was to try to point towards traffickers as the problem, individual deviants, rather than border policy, right? Which is why people take really risky, terrifying routes. And then you saw in Parliament, then you get Conservative politicians asking questions about why there aren't more checks on lorries and this kind of thing. So you start getting that stuff coming into play, all under the guise of, well, we care about these victims, right? You actually had a month later, 10 men found in the back of a lorry in Essex again, struggling to breathe, and they were all arrested on suspicion of immigration offences. And the only difference when those doors are opened is death and being alive. So, and you see this around the world, this pattern of modern slavery, anti-slavery being used to legitimise harder borders. And it's, by the way, it's got a long history. In chapter 1, I explain the rise of the new abolitionist movement, and it explains how much these two things have always been so intimately entwined. But Trump did it. Oh, is he gone yet? I don't know.
Could be gone by the time we finish this evening.
The Mexico Wall, like always, how he legitimized it, very prurient, completely false by all reports of people on the ground about women being trafficked, sexual exploitation, and that's why, one of his ways of legitimizing the wall. But you also, one of the things that I think is I've got a couple of bits in the book where I show this. It's a topic where their own frame starts to break, right? Because you have, for example, a Conservative MP, I think Philip Hollowbone is his name, talking in Parliament about trafficking and saying this trade in human beings, but also in the same breath saying that they need to be sent back to France. Right? So is it a trade, people being treated as commodities, horrifically exploited, who presumably, we would want to support, or should they be sent back to France? Which is it? And it's the same, it's the same 5 sentences he says it. And again, one of the real corkers, in my opinion, is the former Italian Prime Minister, who wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, in which he said we should use anti-piracy tactics on boats of trafficking victims. Now, I don't know much about piracy, but I believe pirate boats have pirates in them, not victims of exploitation. And I do know one of the tactics used against them is sniper fire. So, you start to see
the engines, taking out the captain.
Yeah, the level of disingenuity is suddenly, like, if you actually read the language, you're like, well, what the hell is happening here? I just say the other way that these topics intersect, which I explain, extensively in the book is that migration policy directly facilitates and causes the things that would come under the Modern Slavery Act. It does that by the hostile environment making people unable to and afraid to seek support, to raise problems with labour inspection or with police. It is directly used as a tool of coercion by exploiters. That is, like, documented by everyone, that it is how they will coerce and keep people in these situations, that you'll be detained and deported if you try and get help. And then there's specific visas where the terms of the visa directly fuel exploitation. A prime example being the overseas domestic worker visa, that effectively at the moment stops the women, mainly women, from changing employer.
They can't move. You've covered this this is outrageous.
Yeah, I explain it. I'll explain it in a whistle-stop nutshell. And there is also a petition that I'll mention. So basically, for people, I've realised sometimes people don't know what migrant domestic worker means. I realised recently, which I hadn't before, but it means a migrant who's come to work in someone's household as, for example, a nanny or a cleaner or a housekeeper. And before 1998, they came just on a stamp in the passport of their employer that was coming to the UK, and that basically was, like, really informal. It meant they couldn't leave their employer without risking immigration control. Not a good situation. These are mainly women working in isolated and hidden contexts, dependent on their employer for food and shelter. So it's like huge power differential, let alone if you embed that into the visa term as well. Then thankfully, amazing campaigners got that changed. So from 1998 to 2012, these women could change employer and they could renew their visa, which makes it easier to change employer. Then 2012, guess what? Hostile environment, of course. So this new visa came in that stopped them from changing employers. It was a tied visa. And this led to an upsurge in exploitation and harm. The amazing charity Kalayan campaigned extensively on it, and the Human Rights Watch published a report that, effectively it documents torture, like people only being given 2 hours to sleep, not enough food, no sanitary towels. Now, that is when the Modern Slavery Act was a bill in Parliament. That Human Rights Watch report was 2014. So obviously, what a perfect vehicle. Here we have a law that's designed to stop exploitation. Here we have a bit of law that's causing exploitation. We can put into that law a change. And there was a massive campaign to try to make that happen. And the government was intransigent. It didn't change it. Indeed, the respondent for government tried to say basically that because the women have contracts, it's all fine, and you're conflating the overseas domestic worker visa with trafficking, which is, key against this modern slavery idea that it's nothing to do with underlying policy. It's just a separate thing that some bad person is doing. Eventually, in 2016 Immigration Act, they amended it so you can change employer, but you cannot renew your visa. It is, you know, almost impossible to change employer under those terms because they're 6-month visas. So you've arrived, you've ended up in increasingly exploitative circumstances, you've got the courage up to leave, you want to leave, and you've got, what, 2 months left on your visa to get someone to employ you as a nanny when you've got no prior relationship with the family and you're going to have to go really soon. It just doesn't work. And like the frontline organizations like Calayan and Voice of Domestic Workers are just really clear this doesn't work, and government is just not listening, unsurprisingly. So there is a petition, I think, that Ruth is going to share the link, that I'd really like
the chat box. Yeah,
really ask people to sign. I think it's nearly at 5,000 signatures. It's an e-petition on the government, so if it gets to 10,000 they have to respond, and it would be really wonderful if people could take 2 minutes to do that. And remember to click the email that they ask you to click afterwards, otherwise your signature won't actually like happen.
Brilliant. We'll make sure that people get the link. I mean, it's sort of, at a time when kind of there's very little that can surprise us. It's still all just, you know, shocking and depressing. My question, I guess, at this point is, anybody who knows about, you know, labor exploitation, anyone who knows about how borders operate, how labor markets and labor law operates, and how sort of exploitation happens, says with kind of no ambiguity that the problems are quite obvious and the solutions might not be easy, but it is still nonetheless like very clear where we could start in terms of, you know, for one, don't pass laws that create the conditions for exploitation, or don't push people into the grey economy and take away their right to seek protection. And yet we don't see any action. There is this gaslighting from government, not just here but everywhere where this happens. Do you think that it's, and I mean feel free to say all or none of the above as well, but is it just incompetence, or is it more malignant than that? Is there at the level of the state that degree of kind of disconnect from reality? What is it that kind of allows them to maintain that level of inaction, or just taking all the wrong types of action?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I actually think, well, I should say, I think there's a distinction between kind of the politicians in power and the civil servants. And I think a lot of civil servants would like to see things different to what they are. But yeah, I think it varies, right? I've thought about this quite a lot, actually. I think for some people it is just totally malignant. I think it is. I think some of those people are in very high positions of power in our country today. But I think other people, you know, I thought about like Theresa May quite a lot, and like, what does she actually think about this topic? Because she and the main advisor that is sort of behind this in her term as Home Secretary and Prime Minister have continued to speak about the topic a lot. And kind of, I think that it is there's a malignant quarter, and then I think there are a lot of people who, because their underlying ideology is market knows best, small state, you know, the like kind of like social mobility is like an individual choice, consumers are the answer, this kind of what we can call a like neoliberal logic underlying everything. But because that's their ideology, I think when they care about something, I think, you know, Theresa May maybe does care about modern slavery, but in that way that it's like entirely separate from everything else, and like there's like a refusal, a kind of it can't fit, you know, their frame is created that way because there's an ideology that painted that frame, if you see what I mean. I don't mean to say, by the way, like, you know, poor Theresa May, but I just mean, I think it's like, I think they might both care about really extreme exploitation and be completely unwilling and unable to connect it to the whole, which leaves us in the same place.
It's very similar to what we see with lots of other injustices. It's sort of like, you know, we've seen it over the last week with what's been happening in America. You know, it's much easier to say, yeah, I really don't think you should burn down, you know, the Capitol or the Congress, but many people will have found it quite difficult over a number of years to say, actually, we're kind of opposed to all forms of systemic racism or anti-democratic behavior or what have you. It's much easier to point to the sort of obvious, really extreme example, particularly when it's put in the frame of slavery and using the language of slavery, and to have some sort of emotional or moral belief that we should get rid of it without really feeling comfortable dealing with the idea that perhaps our entire system is complicit.
Yeah,
and we
exactly.
are as well.
Yeah, and I think that when you realize that that's the logic that's operating under what's going on, it makes sense why certain things are happening that shouldn't be. So, for example, one of the favored sort of new abolitionist conservative lines is to make the consumer, which we all apparently are, rather than like people, into responsible for kind of policing and addressing this thing. And Theresa May, said in speeches she wants buying from somewhere with slavery in the supply chain to be as socially unacceptable as using a disposable coffee cup, right? Well, so you can see why she thinks that we individually are so important, because she doesn't believe in the state. She believes that the market, so that market choice, you start to see how that filters through. Of course, it actually there is a tiny role in terms of consumer power, but it is absolutely minimal and overstated, and it makes no sense. How do you know I'm using a disposable plastic coffee cup? Because I'm holding it in front of you. How do you know if a company that you're buying from has slavery in its supply chain? Well, okay, you can look at the modern slavery statement. Are you going to look at the brand? Are you going to look at the shop you're buying it from? Are you going to look at the manufacturer? Which one are you going to look at? When you look at it, you're going to find a statement with a load of other policies linked. Are you going to read them all? Do you know what they really mean? Do you know if it means action?
Is everybody going to go out and buy a Bloomberg terminal and do like complete supply chain analysis every time they buy? Right,
and even are the indicators in that what we need to see? Because are trade unions in there? Probably not, because this is through through that really problematic frame. Like, so the whole thing it's ridiculous. In summary.
In summary, it's all ridiculous. The book isn't. The book is brilliant. And before we jump to questions, I'll just point out that Stuart MacDonald from the Scottish National Party has said that this is a thought-provoking and essential read, especially if you believe that great progress in tackling modern slavery is imminent. Kenway forces us to reconsider how we even think and talk about exploitation, and keeping it north of the border. Frankie Boyle says that this is a horrifying expose about how modern slavery is being used by elites against those most in need in our society, a must read. So please do, if you're interested in learning more, buy a copy. This is absolutely essential reading. I'm going to jump to questions now. We've had loads come in while we've been talking, and they've just been popped in this chat over here. Question from Ron Mendel. So we'll take, I think, looking at the clock, we've got 17 minutes. So we'll maybe take 4 or 5 questions and see if we've got time for more once we're done with those. Ron Mendel asks, how has the pandemic affected our ability to curb modern slavery and its attendant exploitation?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think, in my opinion, and I think a lot of other people that work on this topic, it's going to be really frightening over the next year or so, because of those like preconditions for exploitation are going to worsen so much. Destitution, lack of options, and so on. One of the strange things that happened in 2020 is that obviously everything kind of became less visible. So I believe we're going to see a drop in the number of people identified as potential victims of exploitation who've been referred into support, and that is going to have a kind of knock-on effect into this year and beyond.
And is that the move? Is that because people, obviously there's not many front of house roles, things are closed, people are working behind closed doors, or is it because the enforcement apparatus or the places that people can go and report things are also just under stress?
A bit of both. Like, as we all know, there was that utterly, spring, summer last year was utterly bizarre, and everything kind of like stopped and went inside. So it's a bit of both, really. And I think also the likely economic impacts of the pandemic are going to mean that we potentially see a massive spike. Not only because of poverty, for example, but because people, the more you have desperate people to earn, the more they're going to say yes to bad job offers. And this is where one of the things, that I talk about in the book is that how the media will tend to talk about victims of exploitation as having been duped or lured. Lured is a favorite word. And actually, a lot of people who end up in situations that would fall under the Modern Slavery Act have made a rational choice to say yes to a job offer that turned out to be like dodgy or deceptive in some way, because they had very few options. That was their only option. It's a really pernicious idea that there's just all these like really ignorant people walking around who say yes to any like duping job offer. So we're going to have a lot more pool of very vulnerable people, and I think that's really frightening.
And of course, the state, like the government response to rising unemployment and destitution, unfortunately, tends to be to loosen labour market restrictions, because they call it friction, right? They say, well, the problem is that people are prevented from getting crappy exploitative jobs, and that's why there's unemployment. So we should be all watching out for actually further loosening, particularly now that we're not part of the European framework for regulating any of these things. It's like Dickens, but with smartphones.
Exactly.
Someone's asked here. Someone's asked when we can all have access. How can we ensure? Don't know if you want to touch on this. Someone's asked how we can ensure that all people in the UK have access to the coronavirus vaccine. I'm not sure if that's.
Well, I mean,
Emily.
Presumably, I mean, I'll improvise. I obviously haven't written about access to the vaccine in the book, but I think, this does play into a really clear parallel, which is that you have a population of people that won't be able to because they're trying to stay under the radar because of immigration policy. And those are the same people that can't safely go to labour inspection or police when someone's abusing them. So it's just like compounding that. So clearly, removing that condition, removing the hostile environment, it should be part of a just approach to the vaccine.
Yeah, and we've written to Sage, I think this week, regarding exactly this, which is, we've obviously seen like quite shocking levels of inaction from the government on making sure that people in exploitation, people without secure immigration status have access to healthcare during the pandemic. And now, obviously, the goal with an immunization program is widespread immunity, which you're just not going to get if there's people who are sufficiently scared of the authorities that they're not going to come forward. Exactly. Powell has asked, what do you think of the informal labour market within, for example, South Asian communities, so within diaspora communities, and the exploitation of undocumented people within those communities? Is that, I guess he wants to know, is that something covered in the book or something that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I am familiar with it to some extent, and there are places in the book it's covered. It's not like a section of its own. But I think that one of the problems we have with the kind of immigration policy that we have is that you have, if you're coming to the UK as a migrant to work, and you may be coming in legally, you can't kind of safely sense check job offers and where you're going to, and this kind of thing, because even if you're coming in legally, there's this deterrent effect of this border policing attitude. And I talk in the book about, I don't think it's like a simple solution at all. And I sort of just outline some ideas, but if we have borders, then there could be a role for them to play in terms of supporting people to know whether the job they're going to, for example, is a real one. Knowing what peer support networks there are, knowing what numbers to call, what their rights are, that kind of thing. And that's obviously that's not how we think about borders. That's a choice. Everything's been made up by humans. It's a choice that we're using borders to try to keep people out and scare people. There are really awful cases of, there's a particular man I think of who was actually from Bangladesh and came to, got a job, he thought, as a well-paid job, like 18 grand a year as a chef, leaving behind his wife and baby because he was struggling to support them at home. Turned up, ended up horrifically exploited in a hotel in Scotland. He was working like 22-hour days, 7 days a week for no pay, escalated to physical violence. Now, there's a few things that could help with that kind of thing, but one of them is like, how could that have been prevented from happening in the first place? Like, sure, there's stuff at like where, you know, where he's from, but like, you know, that we've got people coming into the country who need to be provided with that information, and we don't do anything about that. You know, when Focus on Labour Exploitation has just published like rights leaflets for migrant workers going into Scotland to work in agriculture that gives that kind of information. But this is a charity that's doing that. That's completely insane if we actually want to tackle modern slavery. But do we? Do we actually want cheap migrant labour?
Yeah, indeed. Kieran has messaged on here as well and said, do you think that we've reached a stage where the term modern slavery is more problematic than productive? And if so, how can we change the narrative to be more nuanced and effective? And Matthew has echoed that, saying, how do we talk about this? And do we need to totally rethink the way we speak about the issue?
Yeah, so this is kind of the big question, isn't it, in a way? And I think that firstly, it's worth saying that I know that there were people working on exploitation, you know, 10 years ago, whatever, that that this was an important way of framing exploitation to try to get any attention from politicians of things that were going on. And I respect that. I think it has not worked out as a tactic, and has been co-opted and has backfired essentially. And now we have this mad entrenched situation of total hypocrisy. So I think we ought to be just talking about exploitation. I interviewed one of my kind of favorite interviewees in the book is the former head of anti-trafficking, the former head of the human trafficking and kidnap unit at the Metropolitan Police. And he agrees, you know, and as I think most of the interviewees agree, we need to be talking about exploitation. This idea of modern slavery is really not very helpful. It's not very helpful for the public to understand what's going on. It's not helpful for workers. That's not to say that some people in these awful situations don't feel that they are in situations of slavery and that they look really like situations of slavery. I completely respect that. And there's so many testimonies when someone says, I was a slave, I was a slave. That's not at all to the detriment of that lived experience, but it's about there is political power in how any issue is talked about, and it's about questioning that and changing that. So I think we have to start talking about it as exploitation, as a product of the socio-economic fabric, not an accidental thing on top of that fabric. And that's the only way that we're going to get sensible change. That said, that's a much scarier prospect, as I talk about in the book. Like, the modern slavery story is really neat. Yeah, it's horrible, but actually you've got a really clear hero, you know, business, consumers, government. You've got it can be eradicated. Apparently we can totally eradicate exploitation. We can free and liberate everyone. You can't move for the word freedom being used all the time. So I think that's really what we have to do, is hold people's lived experience of exploitation and respect the ways they wish to talk about it, and have a politically strategic way of trying to make change.
Someone, Alison has asked a question, which I guess along with the pandemic is the sort of issue of the hour. How does leaving the EU impact the safety and security of people at risk of labour exploitation and modern slavery?
Yeah, so I mean, it really does, and it does it in a handful of ways. One of which is that there are thought to be a lot of EU citizens in the UK who won't end up applying for the settlement scheme. Either they don't know about it, or they don't realise they need to, whatever reason, or they're in exploitation at the moment and they can't. Or they, you know, who knows what's going to happen when people have got pre-settled status and they're trying to get settled. How much are we going to see that taper off? I think that's a big question. So basically what you're doing there is creating a new pool of people that are subject to immigration control, that come under the hostile environment. And when you do that, you're creating a pool of people with this constructed vulnerability. Immigration policy is directly constructing a vulnerability in. So that it creates a major new risk. Secondly, you've got short-term visas for particular sectors coming in, like agriculture, where we used to have mainly Eastern European workers coming with freedom of movement. And those visas are really recognised to be high risk for being exploited under them for various reasons. Focus on Labour Exploitation has done brilliant work on that if people want to have a look at it. And it also puts at risk support for survivors, which in England is not in statute. So there's a peer, Lord McCall of Dulwich, has been trying to get a bill passed that would put support for survivors on a statutory footing and also give survivors the right discretionary leave to remain for 12 months, because we deport plenty of victims of exploitation, including children. And there's this bill, government has just said in the last week they don't agree with this bill. They don't like the bill, but there's a huge campaign to try to make it happen. And if you want to find out more about that, you can go to freeforgood.org.uk. Which
put that link in the mail as well.
Yeah. So that's a kind of broad outline of how Brexit impacts this situation.
In fact, what you've just pointed out, that sort of disagreement with that, it does just make you feel like on the sort of Labour end of things, Labour with a small L, Labour regulations and Labour markets, there's a real fear that if we admit that the causes of this are these underlying conditions of exploitation, then it'll somehow open the floodgates. In my mind as well, it should. But it will open the floodgates for like much wider labour market reforms. And similarly, if we grant discretionary leave to remain, or we grant 12 months leave to people who are survivors, then we'll have to make the whole of the immigration system and the whole of the border system humane, because and so you really get the sense that there's a sort of like a holding of the dam in a way that the government just can't bring itself to concede that these systems of its own creation have created injustice, because otherwise it will have to disassemble the whole thing in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's it's almost funny in the sense that you can feel like Theresa May and her advisor, when this was all kind of kicking off in 2013 at her level, being like thinking it's this separable thing, because that's the only way she can think. And now over like 5 years, 6 years, I guess nearly, it's like, turned out to be about everything. And this is profoundly uncomfortable, especially for this kind of government. It's I was talking to a journalist the other day about kind of Home Office attitude to this stuff. And I think that the journalist was asking me, why is it that modern slavery is just not a priority? Is it that immigration is the priority, immigration control over modern slavery? And I said, no, I don't think it's even about priorities. I think it's a no-through road. Changing immigration stuff is a no-through. It's just not changing the underlying conditions. They're not even on the same list.
Concede nothing. Don't even go there. Yeah. Well, someone's asked a nice positive question. In fact, a couple of people have. What can people do? We've talked a bit about how consumer power isn't really, consumer power is a bit overhyped as somehow we as the consumers with our £20 of disposable money when we go to the market can undo systemic injustice without the power of strong legislation and regulation. But what can people do?
It's a really good question. It's also the favourite question of all radio presenters ever when you do stuff about modern slavery. I think, I'll just say there is a role for us to be aware of what we might be looking for if somebody is experiencing severe exploitation. But this has been made into like something that's unique to modern slavery, where you get spot the signs of slavery posters and apps and stuff like that. This is just normal. I don't know about anyone else, but when I was growing up, it was about domestic violence. And how do you know if someone in your life is experiencing a woman's experiencing domestic violence at home? If you see someone getting mugged, you might well do something about it. This is just normal for harm in society. So obviously, you know, if you think that there's something really awful going on with someone, ideally do something about it. The gentleman I mentioned who was exploited in the Scottish hotel, there was a woman who frequented the bar of that hotel, and who, after finding out what had been happening, she said, my God, I wish I'd asked more questions, because I felt like something wasn't right. You know, and none of us want to be in that position. And of course, I think with purchasing power, really the only space that this is relevant is your small high street kind of businesses that are going to feel the impact of that shift, right? Because too few people will choose on that basis. But if it's just like a you know, standalone hand car wash that suddenly has 30% less custom, then that's quite relevant. If it's a massive corporate, really, you're not doing anything. The other thing that people can do is get behind these causes that we've outlined and talked about, you know, like support JCWI's campaign, support attempts to get rid of the hostile environment, support anything that you see about properly regulating companies instead of just letting them do whatever they like. You know, it's not as sexy and neat as being like, end slavery now by downloading this app. That doesn't work. And I think one thing we have to be really careful of, I feel like it's like a millennial disease, and I am technically a millennial, so I'm insulting myself as well, but this idea that issues of social injustice can be solved in like profit making, fancy high tech ways. Like, this is about poverty and unionization and addressing like these deep core factors. And that might be a longer game, and that might mean you need to get involved in local politics to make sure you vote in particular ways and all of that stuff. But it is the only way.
One of the most important, on that note, one of the most important things that readers will take away from this book, and in that sense, I put it, you know, very much alongside Winner Takes All by Anand Giridharadas, who's a sort of South Asian American author. Is it completely shatters the myth that you can try and address an issue which is inherently political. It's about power, it's about justice, it's about some people being able to dominate other people because the system and the structures allow them to. You can't address those in ways that are apolitical. You can't do this with an app. You can't McKinsey your way out of slavery. You can't, there's no spreadsheet that will do this for us. It's about justice, it's about power, it's about that whole ecosystem of exploitation. It's a really just a very brilliant book. Again, I recommend that everybody that's joined us this evening, or anyone that's watching this on demand afterwards, go out and get a copy, or if you're allowed to go. Is anyone allowed to go out? Or just get a copy somehow and read it. I'm sure there's an ebook available as well. Pluto Press, again, if you order before the 20th of January, are very generously donating £1 for every copy pre-ordered to JCWI. I wish the book an amazing amount of success. Thank you, Emily. This has been an incredibly important and interesting event. I hope everybody took a lot away from that, and we'll be sending out an email with any of the links that we've discussed a bit later on.
Thank you.